All right, so it's 4 o'clock UK time, so let's get started. So welcome to, this is the second online excitELT. And so I'm really happy to be able to kind of be in this position to launch the conference. And also I'm really happy that we've got so many people who have turned up. And I think we've got lots of people joining at this moment. So that's really, really great. So my name's Tim. I'm one of the organizers of excitELT, and so we're like a conferencing organization that have teamed up with Dr. Rose and Dr. Galloway's groups to run this conference. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say something very quickly at the start before I'll try and keep this as quick as possible. Just to kind of, yeah, talk a little bit about the structure of the conference and also a bit about this conference as well. Yeah, so like I said, excitELT, we've been running conferences. This is our sixth one. It's our second online one. And I guess it's probably, I don't know, Heath will tell you, but it's probably like one of the least formal conferences you go to. It's a very friendly conference. We really enjoy kind of chatting to people. We try and keep it as friendly as possible. So we really hope that, yeah, like we're going to have breakout rooms and stuff later. So we really hope you use this opportunity to not just to kind of learn from speakers. We've got some really great speakers and they got a lot of very interesting things to talk about, but also use this opportunity to kind of meet each other, talk to each other, make some connections. I think we've got people from all over the globe. Actually, if people could put in the chat, if you could leave a message and tell us where you're joining from, that would be really interesting to see. So just very quickly, we're going to have 2 talks today, and after each talk, we're going to have a discussion. And so we'll break up into breakout rooms and kind of discuss some questions from the speakers. So first we've got Kari, and then Pramod is going to talk in a little bit. But before all of that, I just wanted to invite Dr. Heath Rose, who I don't think needs much introduction, so I will actually just skip that completely, to start the conference and introduce our first speaker.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. So is it okay if I share my it just says host has disabled host disabled attendee screen sharing. So maybe I'm just need my settings changed. Otherwise, I can just speak. Okay, so while Tim's looking into that, this is the joy. See, informal conference. I just to say welcome to everybody. So my name's Heath Rose. So I'm from the University of Oxford, where I coordinate a research group called the EMI Oxford Research Group. And the event today is held over 2 days, and it's held in collaboration with excitELT, but also with the network, which is called Teaching English in Global Contexts and Teaching in English in Global Contexts. So looking at global Englishes and EMI research and implications. And so today we're going to be focusing on the second of those themes, which is English medium instruction. And for those who are doing the double day, on Sunday, we're going to be speaking on the first theme, which is on global Englishes. And so this one, we're focusing on that second part of the conference theme, which is teaching in English in global contexts. So particularly implications for English medium instruction. And so really, if you had a look at the conference website, you'll see that we are 3 different groups with 2 themes for the conference, but we have one shared vision. And so I think, first of all, the group that I'm representing, which is the EMI Oxford Research Group, it was set up by Ernesto Macaro quite a number of years back as a research group that was really trying to lead or as impartially as possible investigate the phenomenon of English medium instruction. And so we're quite excited actually to branch into new territory by collaborating in this conference, by also taking a somewhat critical look at some of the underlying social and justice issues that underlie English medium instruction. So that's, our mission is to better understand this phenomenon excitELT, which Tim mentioned, is a conference organization that aims to invigorate teaching through participant-driven sharing of knowledge. And so I think that's quite a nice partnership for us to have, where we can forge greater connections with teachers and make stronger connections between perhaps a group like ours, research knowledge, and a lot of the professional and contextual knowledge of the people participating in this conference, because we don't have all the answers. English medium instruction has its own unique challenges in each context, and we really need to have a lot of that contextualized understanding to really pick apart and find solutions to many of the problems that are thrown towards educational organizations. And then finally, probably a nice bridge between these research and teaching focuses of the two organizations, we have the network, which is the Teaching English in Global Contexts and Teaching in English in Global Contexts. So that network was formed by Nicola Galloway and really was to forge greater connections between those working globally, both in research and in practice, to share ideas on a platform. And so currently that network started at the University of Edinburgh, but will soon be migrating over to a platform hosted by the University of Glasgow. And so Nicola might talk a little bit more about that at the end of the conference today. And so today we're focusing on EMI, Sunday, tomorrow on global Englishes. And so when we're talking about English medium instruction, we can see there's a lot of contention in definitions. The definition our research group adopts is that by Ernesto Macaro, who defines English medium instruction as the use of English language to teach academic subjects other than English itself in countries or jurisdictions where the first language of the majority of the population is not English. But Macaro says this is a very contentious definition, that we can really pick apart, well, what exactly do we mean by English language? What exactly do we mean by subjects other than English itself? Where do we draw the line? What exactly do we mean when we talk about in countries and jurisdictions where the first language of the majority of the population is not English? So where do we draw the line? The more that we kind of unpick this definition, the more kind of issues that emerge that we have to investigate and challenge. And so I think for those here in the conference, we know that English medium instruction has been growing at a phenomenal rate. Chappell refers to it as a galloping phenomenon. Macaro refers to it as an unstoppable train. And I know the second speaker today is actually going to look at that metaphor a little bit more closely. But we've seen huge increases in EMI, particularly over the last 30 years in Europe. The last 20 years in places like China, we've seen huge developments in English medium instruction. More recently, we're seeing English medium instruction grow at rapid rate in East Asia and Southeast Asia. We're starting to see more and more similar movements occurring in Latin America as well. And so it really is a global phenomena. But like I said, each context has its own challenges. So what we've seen a lot of research come out of English medium instruction lately, but we still have a number of unanswered questions. And so some of these might be, what inequalities and injustices have arisen out of English medium instruction? Is English medium instruction best enacted as English only, or is there room for multilingual, plurilingual medium instruction approaches? And if so, what is the role of those other languages in the EMI classrooms? And perhaps how can teachers use the L1 for what functions to have the best pedagogical effect? And so these are some questions we're still grappling with, both as researchers and as practitioners. And these are some of the issues that the speakers today will unpick. And so just to introduce the first speaker of today. So we have Kari Sahan. So to tell you a little bit more about Kari, she holds a PhD in applied linguistics from the University of Oxford from the Department of Education. She played a key role in our research group while she was here. Her research focuses on English medium instruction, language education policy, and classroom interaction. And so she's still a researcher with us. Actually, she's heavily involved in helping lead a scoping project at the moment through the British Council to better understand how or what EMI looks like. And we're looking actually up to 50 countries. So quite a big job ahead of us. So we're still happy to have her as part of our research group. She's also the assistant project lead and webinar coordinator for the online network that Nicola Galloway created. And so that's the Teaching English and Teaching in English in Global Contexts. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Kari.
Thank you, Heath. Let me try and share my screen here. Can everyone hear me? Is my audio all right?
Sounds good. You should be able to share your screen, Kari. Is it working?
I think it is.
There we go. Yeah.
How's that? Can you see it?
Yes.
Oh, that's great. All right. Thank you, Heath, for the introduction, and thanks, Tim, for organizing this today. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to share some of my research with all of you. And I know that we have people joining from every corner of the world, so it'd be really quite interesting to also hear how the research findings that I'm going to discuss may or may not be applicable to the context in which you all work or perhaps even study. But what I want to focus on today is language use in EMI. So Heath brought up some of these things in his introduction, some of the questions about should English be implemented as English only? Is there room for a multilingual or a bilingual model of EMI? And these are the themes that I want to unpack. So I will largely be drawing from my doctoral research today and sharing with you some of the findings from that. But to sort of contextualize the questions that I'm asking, I want to put up this definition of EMI again. This is the definition that Heath shared with us. It's the definition that we use in the EMI Oxford Research Group. And certainly it's a definition that can be criticized and picked apart. But specifically, the part that I want to focus on is this very first part, the use of the English language to teach. And while that might on the surface seem relatively straightforward, it raises a lot of questions. What do we mean by the use of English? What English or whose English should be used? Should it be only English? Is there room for other languages? And what about the local language, particularly in contexts where the majority of students are local, domestic students, and the teacher also shares that language or is a local teacher as well? And now before going too much into my research, I want to share with you my motivation for this study. How did I even become interested in EMI? For me, my interest in EMI began when I was working as an English teacher in Turkey. I was working at an EMI university and I was working in the PrEP program. I'll talk a bit more about the PrEP program later, or the PrEP system in Turkey. But essentially, in this role as an English teacher, my job, our job, was to prepare students for EMI study. Where I was working, they were being prepared for engineering courses. So students came to us with a very low level of English. They typically started at the beginner level, and we had one academic year to get them ready to study engineering content in English. And then we sent them off after they passed our proficiency exam, and they went off to their English medium classes, and we really had no idea what happened after that. So as an English instructor, I wondered what happens to our students after they go on to their engineering classes. What is actually happening in those engineering classes, and what are their language needs? And so from this, I began to be interested in EMI research. Specifically, I am interested in how EMI is implemented with respect to language use. And there's a growing body of research that's looking at language use. But when we think about EMI implementation, it's very context specific. So Dearden has said that there's little empirical research conducted into why and when EMI is introduced, and moreover, little research into how it is actually delivered. Maccaro et al. In their systematic review conclude that there was a lack of a consensus regarding what EMI in higher education actually is. And I should say that I'm focusing on the higher education context. So EMI might be very different at the secondary or the primary level, but even when we think about universities, EMI in one context can look very different from EMI in another context. The context that I'm specifically focusing on is Turkey. And I know we have a number of participants here joining us from Turkey, so you'll be to some degree familiar with the Turkish context, but for everyone else, let me give you a bit of background. Turkey, I think Turkey is quite a unique context for EMI because it has a very long history of EMI. Foreign language media of instruction began during the Ottoman period. The first example we see of an EMI school in Turkey is a secondary school called Robert College. This was founded in 1863, and to this day, it continues to teach through the medium of English. In the secondary school system, for about 50 years or so, for the second half of the 20th century, there were public schools that delivered at least some of their curriculum through English. These were called Anatolian high schools, and they taught math and science primarily through English. However, these schools now teach through Turkish, so we don't see EMI at the secondary level the same way we saw it maybe 20 or 30 years ago, or even 40 years ago in Turkey. At the tertiary level, which is where I'm focusing, EMI began in the 1950s with the founding of Middle East Technical University. It's an all EMI university, and it still teaches in English. There's a number of other universities that were founded shortly after Middle East Technical that teach in English as well. But even though Turkey has this long history of EMI, I would argue that it's still an expanding EMI context. And part of the reason for this is that there's been massive growth in the higher education sector since about 2008. So over the last 10 or 15 years, the number of higher education institutions in Turkey has more than doubled. That means more students are accessing higher education. And many of these new universities teach either partially or fully through English. They offer EMI programs. And then in order to stay competitive, many older universities have introduced EMI programs. So we see this expansion of EMI in higher education that goes along with the expansion of higher education as a whole. And this means you get a whole new diverse group of students accessing EMI programs. So whereas EMI used to be reserved only to elite institutions, we now see a much different demographic in terms of where EMI is available. Turkey is also a context in which questions have been raised about students' English proficiency. There's a number of questions that have come up in the research regarding whether or not students are adequately prepared for EMI programs. So keeping that context in mind, let me tell you two more things about how EMI is delivered in Turkey, and then we'll jump into the study. In Turkey, there's two models of EMI. One is a full EMI program in which 100% of the curriculum is delivered through English. The other is a partial EMI program in which at least 30% of the curriculum is delivered through English. So even though these partial EMI programs may seem bilingual, they're designed so that the EMI classes are supposed to be English only, and then the remaining up to 70% of courses that students take are supposed to be Turkish only. But you do have this full and this partial model of EMI. Language support for students in Turkey is provided through the preparatory model. So I mentioned that I was working in the prep school before I began my EMI research. The prep school is one of four models that Makarov puts forth as an example of how language support can be provided in EMI programs. I've taken this figure from an upcoming article by Nicola Galloway and Heath Rose, and they've adapted it from Makarov, but it shows four different models of language support in EMI. The prep program would fall into this category here at the top. It's a pre-sessional program that students enroll in before starting their EMI classes. It's typically a one-year program. In Turkey, the way it works is that students enroll in their first year of university in the prep program. They take between 20 and 30 hours of English a week. They're only studying English for this 1 year. And then after this intense program, if they've passed the proficiency exam, then they move on. But the idea here is that you can take students who may have a poor background in English or who may not have any background in English, and you can get them up to speeds that they're ready to dive into their EMI classes. But of course, a lot of questions can be raised in terms of what type of English do these students need? Is what's being taught in the prep program going to match what's actually being taught in EMI classes, or the language that's actually being used in EMI classes? And so that was the motivation for my research. I'm going to talk about two studies today, although they're interrelated. The first is my PhD project, so it's a much larger study. And the second is the pilot study for my PhD project, so it's much smaller. For the larger study, I'm just going to present it very briefly to kind of situate the findings, and then I'm going to give some examples from the smaller study. I'm not going to talk too much about methodology because we have a limited amount of time and I'd rather get into the findings. But for both studies, I collected data through classroom observations, interviews and focus groups, and both studies were looking at engineering departments in which the language of instruction was English. For the larger study, I visited 7 universities. They were all public universities in Turkey, and I had 21 EMI teachers who participated in classroom observations and interviews, and then focus groups with their students. The smaller study was only focusing on one mechanical engineering department at a state university. I had 3 teachers in that study, and then I had focus groups with students from each of their classes, so 3 student focus groups. So if we dive in first to a general overview of the findings from the first study, one thing that I set out to explore in my PhD project was to look at the ways in which language is used in EMI classes. And the very short answer to how is language used is that it's used with great variation. What I found is that the amount of English and Turkish that were used in the 21 classes that I observed varied greatly. And to give you a sense of what I mean when I say it varied greatly, this is a little graph plot here to show you the proportion of Turkish that was used in the classes. You don't have to worry too much about the labels, but the vertical axis will show you the percentage of Turkish used in class. And so you can see that in some classes, there was very little Turkish being used, but in other classes, Turkish was the primary language of instruction, or more than 50% of the class was delivered in Turkish. And then there were a lot of classes, sort of somewhere in the middle here, in which Turkish was used to varying degrees. But one important takeaway from those findings is that none of the classes I observed were English only. Turkish was used in some way by the teachers and the students in that class. In some classes, it was primarily used by students to ask questions, and the teachers used very little Turkish. In other classes, even though it was EMI on paper, and even though English was used to some extent, Turkish was the primary language of instruction. But another important finding to come out of this research was that the ways in which the Turkish was used, it tended to be used on an ad hoc basis or based on the preferences of individual teachers, rather than according to some sort of systematic or principled pedagogy. And I do think that some of this might come from the fact that I'm looking at engineering instructors at the university level who have very little or no training in teaching pedagogy. So only 2 of my 21 teachers had any sort of background in teacher training, and these 2 had received very brief courses as part of their PhD studies in the US to be research assistants. So it's really quite all over the place in terms of how teachers are implementing EMI in practice with respect to language use. But I want to dive in and give some more examples in terms of what I actually mean when I say, how is Turkish used, or Turkish was used in various ways. So I'm going to pull from 3 examples that came out of my pilot study. And I want to focus on the ways in which students used Turkish, the ways in which teachers used Turkish, and then the ways in which teachers and students discuss technical terminology. So the first example I'm going to give looks at the ways in which students use Turkish to ask questions. This example comes from a mechanical engineering department class. It was a class called Statics. It was a first-year class. And prior to the first line of the student statement here, the teacher was discussing an example about acceleration. And so the teacher's explaining the example in English, and then the student jumps in with this Turkish statement. And I've used the word question. The student's not actually formulating a full question, but we can see that the student is getting at a question here. And that can be seen in the 4th line of the text here, in which the teacher says in Turkish, "That's a very good question." So the student is making sense of what's being taught in English in their L1, formulating that to the teacher in the L1. But then if we look at the teacher's response to it, the teacher responds to this question in English. So the teacher is maintaining English as the primary language of instruction, but is allowing the student to engage with the material and ask questions in the L1. Now, when I asked the students why they tended to ask questions in Turkish, they told me that they can explain themselves better in Turkish and that sometimes their English was not enough. So while this points to perhaps problems of proficiency, I think there might also be something deeper here. It's a matter of enough or ease with which they're able to explain that. All of the 21 teachers in my larger study, as well as the 3 teachers in this pilot study, allowed the students to ask questions in Turkish. To varying degrees, they allowed them to use Turkish in class. This one particular teacher, when asked about why students were allowed to use Turkish, gave, I thought, quite an interesting answer. He said that absolutely questions should be asked in English. Questions are normally asked in English, but if we say that students cannot use Turkish, we're taking away their freedom of expression. And so again here, it's perhaps a matter of proficiency, right? Because it's about expressing yourself, but there's something a bit deeper here. When we start thinking about freedom of expression, we're also bringing up questions of identity. We're also bringing up cultural questions. If we have Turkish students and a Turkish teacher, this teacher at least is saying, I'm not comfortable telling my students that they can't speak to me in Turkish, and I'm not comfortable telling them, don't use your L1. So there's quite a lot going on there. In terms of teachers' Turkish use, teachers often use Turkish to provide explanations in class. And this was often when they thought that something required some concept was particularly important or required, a very detailed explanation. And this was made obvious in this one example I have from the third teacher in my pilot study. This teacher was teaching a heat transfer class and was explaining a graph that involved 3 different points of heat transfer. He explained the first point in English, and then when he got to the end of his explanation, he switched to Turkish to say, now that we've understood point 1, we're going to move on to point 2, but then he said, let me explain this in Turkish because it's a very important example, you need to understand it. Then he explained point 2 in Turkish and then went on to point 3 back in English. So you can see here it's a bit strategic in terms of when he's trying to use, or when he's deciding to use Turkish. And when I asked the teachers and students about this particular use of Turkish to give examples or to give explanations in class, the students said that they actually liked it when their teachers provided them with Turkish explanations because it helped at critical points, particularly points that required more detailed explanations. So again, there's echoes of proficiency in here in terms of understanding the details, but I think there might be something else at play. And it's not just a matter of we don't understand English, but it's a matter of at critical points, we perhaps feel more confident hearing the details in Turkish. The teachers gave almost identical explanations. They said it was easier to explain in Turkish, and it was necessary when the students didn't understand. But as we can see, by signaling, let me explain this in Turkish because it's important, the teacher's also using his L1 use here to draw the students in and to let them know that the upcoming point is going to be very important, particularly in comparison to the point before that or the point coming up after it. So those have both focused on Turkish use. The final example I want to give relates to technical terminology and the ways in which technical terms were discussed in the EMI classes I observed. So I've got an example here. And on the surface, it might look very much like my first example. It's an example in which the teacher's providing an explanation in English, and then we see a student question in Turkish. But what I found quite interesting about this student statement is that the student asks a question about inertia, but uses the word inertia in English. There is a word for inertia in Turkish, and the student knew the word for inertia in Turkish, but the student said inertia in English rather than in Turkish. And when I asked, I saw this across all of the classes that I observed, all 21 classes in the large study and all 3 classes in the smaller study. And when I asked teachers and students about this practice, their explanations were actually they were layered. They were quite complicated in terms of this use of terminology. The first thing that students told me was that our classes are in English, our resources are in English, the books we read, the materials we read, everything is in English, so we're learning these terms in English. The teacher said something very similar. They said in the field of engineering, Turkish terminology is just not as dominant as English terminology, so we often use the English. But if we go a bit deeper, the students also told me that some of the technical terms that they were using either didn't have Turkish equivalents or they didn't know the Turkish equivalents. Now, this might raise questions for us in terms of the effect that EMI is having on the local language, or the effect that English as a dominant language in academia might be having on local languages. It also raises a question as to whether or not these students will be equipped to then go and work as engineers in the Turkish context if they don't necessarily know Turkish terminology for very important engineering concepts. Another thing the students told me, one other layer to this issue of terminology, is that they said when we get into technical terminology, everything becomes confusing because we didn't learn this terminology. We didn't learn anything discipline specific in our English prep classes. They said the prep classes were either general English or general academic English. But when they came to their EMI classes, they were encountering this discipline-specific vocabulary for the first time. So they were often learning these terms in English through their EMI classes, while also trying to understand what the concept was itself. And they said that raised some issues for them because they may have encountered words like inertia in their high schools, but they didn't necessarily know the English word until halfway through the lecture about inertia. So I want to wrap up, or I want to summarize these findings with respect to 2 takeaways. The first has to do with language use. And I think a key takeaway is that EMI is not English only, despite policy aims, despite what we might initially think of it as. My findings join a growing body of research to suggest that in practice, EMI is not English only. And I think that means that we as both researchers and teachers and practitioners need to start moving away from models of English-only EMI to models that are more either bilingual or more multilingual inclusive. And when we think about bilingual language use, I think we also have to go beyond simply saying it's an issue of language proficiency. While there might be issues of language proficiency in EMI classrooms, I do think that there's something else at play here. Code switching or translanguaging or language mixing, whichever phrase you want to use, these are all very normal bilingual practices. They're practices that bilinguals use in their daily life. And so there is something artificial about telling students and teachers in class that they can't use the range of linguistic resources available to them. However, if we embrace a bilingual model of EMI, it does raise questions with respect to pedagogy. And one question might be, what does, quote unquote, what do good bilingual teaching practices look like in EMI contexts? Based on the name of this conference, I'm assuming most of us come from an English language teaching background or a foreign language teaching background. And so we might be aware that in our field of applied linguistics, there have been ongoing debates, conversations, research on L1 use in the target language classroom or on multilingualism in language teaching. But what we have to remember is that the language teaching classroom is not quite the same as the EMI classroom. The aims might be different. And while there is a lot of research or a growing body of research looking at language use, there's very little research which has evaluated how effective bilingual teaching practices are in terms of student learning outcomes, or what the most effective bilingual teaching practices might be. So I think that's an area that we need to consider going forward. Makaro, in a recent article, has raised this point, and he says that we do need to be careful drawing on theories from second language acquisition and depositing them without thinking about it critically in EMI classes. He says that the EMI research field is still quite a way away from being able to transplant the ideas that we have in SLA directly into content teaching classrooms. And the final point I want to raise with respect to bilingual models of EMI has to do with the composition of the class. Internationalization is often cited as a common reason to introduce EMI, especially at the level of higher education. But what does that mean if we have a class of a very diverse linguistic profile in our class? What if the class is multilingual? In the context that I was looking at, the teacher and the vast majority of students were Turkish, and they shared an L1, so it was quite easy to use the L1 in class. But in other contexts, this might not be possible. Kutiva, in a recent study looking at language use at EMI programs in Sweden, concluded that while translingual practices, or L1 use, was very helpful in some contexts, it was less desirable in others because it excluded students who didn't share those same linguistic resources. So if we're thinking about bringing in bilingual or multilingual models of EMI, we do have to consider what this might mean in different contexts and how effective it might be in different contexts. And then the final takeaway I want to discuss has to do with the role of the English teacher. I said at the beginning of this talk that my motivation began because I was an English teacher and I wanted to know whether we were preparing our students effectively or how we could better prepare our students. Now the question is, based on these findings, how do we go back to English teachers, communicate these findings, and then what do we do as English teachers to prepare our students better? One obstacle is the divide that exists between content and language teachers. Nicola Galloway and Heath Rose discuss this in their upcoming article in ELTJ. But what we have to remember often is that within schools or within universities, the language teachers and the content teachers might be in two completely different units. They might not even know each other, and this creates obstacles in terms of being able to understand students' needs in EMI, prepare them for EMI, and then also communicate to content teachers how they might be able to support students linguistically. But I would argue that as language teachers, we need to start rethinking what it means for students to be linguistically prepared for EMI. And that might mean that we need to move away from the idea of a general English proficiency or general L2 proficiency. In many contexts, we still teach general English classes as preparation for EMI, and students are often still assessed according to exams that measure their general English proficiency rather than an academic or discipline-specific model of English proficiency. And what I would argue is that we need to consider academic communicative competencies. And so perhaps an ELF-informed or a GELT, a global English language teaching informed pedagogy, may be more appropriate in terms of preparing students to communicate in contexts that are inherently multilingual and in which we have speakers with diverse language backgrounds, including diverse levels of English proficiency. So tomorrow we'll be talking more about global Englishes and GELT, and that will be the nice bridge to go from talking about EMI to talking about what language teachers might be able to do in these contexts. The other thing that I would say is that there's probably a need for more EAP or ESP specific preparation, or even better yet, English for specific academic purposes preparation that would focus more on the discipline needs of students. So that discussion that I had earlier with respect to terminology, that would be an example of where students might benefit from having more discipline specific language education and support prior to beginning their EMI classes. And I think that these are some themes that we can bring out and discuss more in the discussion later. So rather than me going on and on, I think I'll stop there and hand it over to Tim, who can then lead us in our discussion. Yeah.
Okay, that's super. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think one of the things we try and do at excitELT is really try and make people give slightly shorter speeches and see how much of the information they can pack into a shorter speech. And I think you've done a really good job there. So what we're going to do next is we're going to go into breakout rooms. So before I send you all off into breakout rooms, I'm going to share some links. So these links, which you should be able to see in the chat, and they'll stay in the chat as well, even when you're in your breakout room, they'll take you to a Google Doc. And so what I want you to do is when you're in your group, find the correct Google Doc. If you're in breakout room 1, go to the group 1 Google Doc, okay? And yeah, and you'll find some discussion questions in those. And so, yeah, and one thing, you don't have to, but it's really nice if people can, is if one person in each group can kind of volunteer as a scribe to write down what the group is discussing, that means it creates a bit more of a dialogue between the speakers and the groups, and we kind of get to hear what people are thinking. And then we'll share these at the end, so you can kind of see what other groups were talking about as well. And so, yeah, and the other thing I'd say is just remember we have, yeah, we've got a really good mix of kind of, I think, researchers and teachers and people from all over the world. So just, I guess, remember that maybe like not everyone is going to know the same terminology and things like that when you're in your groups. So what we'll do then is I'm just going to send everyone off unless everyone's got any questions.
How long do we have for the?
We have about 15-20 minutes. We'll kind of see how.
Perfect.
Yes, so lots of time.
Back for the second
yes. And yeah, and so we'll take a break in about 15-20 minutes. Okay.